Welcome back to ASMR Storytime. Today we sat in a little cosy corner of my garden. It's dusk at the moment, so it's going to get darker throughout the video, which is fine. So we're returning to chapter 4 of The Willows by Algernon Blackwood. So in the first part of chapter 4, the two characters had discovered various strange things happening to their belongings. A paddle for the canoe had gone missing. The other paddle seemed to have been sanded down. A hole has been cut into the bottom of the canoe. Various other things moved about, and the sanity of both characters is starting to wear thin. So, chapter 4, part 2. They were focusing upon our island, and more particularly upon ourselves, for thus, somehow, in the terms of the imagination, did my really indescribable sensations in this extraordinary place present themselves. I had slept a good deal in the early afternoon, and had thus recovered somewhat from the exhaustion of a disturbed night. But this only served apparently to render me more susceptible than before to the obsessing spell of the haunting. I fought against it, laughing at my feelings absurd and childish, with very obvious physiological explanation. Yet, in spite of every effort, they gained in strength upon me, so that I dreaded the night as a child lost in a forest must dread the approach of darkness. The canoe we had carefully covered with a waterproof sheet during the day, and the one remaining paddle had been securely tied by the Swede to the base of the tree, lest the wind should rob us of that too. From 5 o'clock onwards, I busied myself with the stew pot and preparation for dinner. It being my turn to cook that night, we had potatoes, onions, bits of bacon fat to add flavour, and a general thick residue from former stews at the bottom of the pot, with black bread broken up into it. The result was most excellent, and it was followed by a stew of plums with sugar and a brew of strong tea with dried milk. A good pile of wood lay close at hand, and the absence of wind made my duties easy. My companion sat lazily watching me, dividing his attentions between cleaning his pipe and giving useless advice, an admitted privilege of the off-duty man. He had been very quiet all the afternoon, engaged in recaulking the canoe, strengthening the tent ropes, and fishing for driftwood while I slept. No more talk about undesirable things had passed between us, and I think his only remarks had to do with the gradual destruction of the island, which he declared was not fully a third smaller than when we first landed. The pot had just begun to bubble when I heard his voice calling to me from the bank, where he had wandered away without my noticing. I ran up. "Come and listen," he said, "and see what you make of it." He held his hand cupwise to his ear, as so often before. "Now, do you hear anything?" he asked, watching me go curiously. We stood there, listening attentively together. At first I heard only the deep note of the water and the hissings rising from its turbulent surface. The willows, for once, were motionless and silent. Then a sound began to reach my ears faintly. A peculiar sound, something like the humming of a distant gong. It seemed to come across to us in the darkness from the waste of swamps and willows opposite. It was repeated at regular intervals, but it was certainly neither the sound of a bell nor the hooting of a distant steamer. I can liken it to nothing so much as to the sound of an immense gong far up in the sky, repeating incessantly its muffled metallic note, soft and musical, as it was repeatedly struck. My heart quickened as I listened. "I've heard it all day," said my companion. "While you slept this afternoon, it came all around the island. I hunted it down, but could never get near enough to see, to localize it correctly. Sometimes it was overhead, and sometimes it seemed to be under the water. Once or twice, too, I could have sworn it was not outside at all, but within myself. You know, the way a sound in the fourth dimension is supposed to come." I was too much puzzled to pay much attention to his words. I listened carefully, striving to associate it with any known familiar sound that I could think of, but without success. It changed in the direction too, coming nearer and then sinking utterly away into remote distance. I cannot say that it was ominous in quality, because to me it seemed distinctly musical. Yet I must admit it set going a distressing feeling that made me wish I'd never heard it. "The wind blowing in those sand funnels," I said, determined to find an explanation. "Or the bushes rubbing together after the storm, perhaps." "It comes off the whole swamp," my friend answered. "It comes from everywhere at once." He ignored my explanations. "It comes from the willow bushes somehow." "But now the wind has dropped," I objected. "The willows can hardly make a noise by themselves, can they?" His answer frightened me. First, because I dreaded it, and secondly, because I knew intuitively that it was true. "It is because the wind has dropped that we now hear it. It was drowned before. It is the cry, I believe, of the..." I dashed back to my fire, warned by the sound of bubbling that the stew was in danger, but determined at the same time to escape further conversation. I was resolute, if possible, to avoid the exchanging of views. I dreaded, too, that he would begin about the gods, or the elemental forces, or something else disquieting, and I wanted to keep myself well in hand for what might happen later. There was another night to be faced before we escaped from this distressing place, and there was no knowing yet what it might bring forth. "Come and cut up the bread for the pot," I called to him vigorously, stirring the appetizing mixture. That stew pot held sanity for us both, and the thought made me laugh. He came over slowly and took the provision sack from the tree, fumbling in its mysterious depths and then emptying the entire contents upon the ground sheet at his feet. "Hurry up," I cried, "it's boiling." The Swede burst out into a new roar of laughter that startled me. It was forced laughter, not artificial exactly, but mirthless. "There's nothing here," he shouted, holding his sides. "Bread, I mean. It's gone. There is no bread. They've taken it." I dropped the long spoon and ran up. Everything the sack had contained lay upon the ground, but there was no loaf. The whole dead weight of my growing fear fell upon me and shook me. Then I burst out laughing too. It was the only thing to do, and the sound of my laughter also made me understand his. The stain of psychological pressure caused it, this explosion of unnatural laughter in both of us. It was an effort of repressed forces to seek relief. It was a temporary safety valve, and with both of us it ceased quite suddenly. "How criminally stupid of me," I cried, still determined to be consistent and find an explanation. "I clean forgot to buy a loaf at Pressburg. That chattering woman put everything out of my mind, and I must have left it lying on the counter. Oh, the oatmeal, too, is much less than it was this morning," the Swede interrupted. Why in the world need he draw attention to it, I thought angrily. "There's enough for tomorrow," I said, stirring vigorously, "and we can get lots more at Corman or Gran. In 24 hours we shall be miles from here." "I hope so, to God," he muttered, putting the things back into the sack, "unless we're claimed first as victims for the sacrifice." He added with a foolish laugh. He dragged the sack into the tent for safety's sake, I suppose, and I heard him mumbling to himself, but so indistinctly that it seemed quite natural for me to ignore his words. Our meal was beyond question a gloomy one, and we ate it almost in silence, avoiding one another's eyes and keeping the fire bright. Then we washed up and prepared for the night, and once smoking, our minds unoccupied with any definite duties, the apprehension I had felt all day became more and more acute. It imagine this stressed me far more. That if I could have been able to tick it and face it squarely. The curious sound I've likened to the note of a gong began to become more incessant and filled the stillness of the night with a faint, continuous ringing rather than a series of distinct notes. At one time it was behind, and at another it was in front of us. Sometimes I fancied it came from the bushes on our left, and then again from the clumps on our right. More often it hovered directly overhead, like the whirring of wings. It was really everywhere at once, behind, in front, at our sides and over our heads, completely surrounding us. The sound really defies description, but nothing within my knowledge is like that ceaseless muffled humming rising off the deserted world of swamps and willows. We sat smoking in comparative silence, the strain growing every minute greater. The worst feature of the situation seemed to me that we did not know what to expect and could therefore make no sort of preparation by way of defence. We could anticipate nothing. My explanations made in this sunshine, moreover, now came to haunt me with their foolish and wholly unsatisfactory nature, and it was more and more clear to us that some kind of plain talk with my companion was inevitable, whether I liked it or not. After all, we had to spend the night together and to sleep in the tent side by side. I saw that I could not get along much longer without the support of his mind, and for that, of course, plain talk was imperative. As long as possible, however, I postponed this little climax, tried to ignore or laugh at the occasional sentences he flung into the emptiness. Some of these sentences, moreover, were confoundedly disquieting to me, coming as they did to corroborate much that I felt myself. Corroboration, too, which made it so much more convincing. From a totally different point of view, he composed such curious sentences and hurled them at me in such an inconsequential sort of way, as though his main line of thought was secret to himself, and these fragments were mere bits he found it impossible to digest. He got rid of them by uttering them. Speech relieved him. It was like being sick. There are things about us, I'm sure, that make for disorder, disintegration, destruction. Our destruction, he said once, while the fire blazed between us. We strayed out of a safe line somewhere. And another time, when the gong sounds had come nearer, ringing much louder than before and directly over our heads, he said, as though talking to himself, gramophone would show any record of that. The sound doesn't come to me by the ears at all. The vibrations reach me in another manner altogether and seem to be within me, which is precisely how a fourth dimensional sound might be supposed to make itself heard. I purposely made no reply to this, but I sat up a little closer to the fire and perceived about me into the darkness. The clouds were massed all over the sky, and no trace of moonlight came through. Very still, everything was, so that the river and the frogs had things all their own way. It has that about it, he went on, which is utterly out of common experience. It is unknown. Only one thing describes it, really. It is a non-human sound. I mean, a sound outside humanity. Having rid himself of this indigestible morsel, he lay quiet for a time, but he had so admirably expressed my own feelings that it was a relief to have the thought out, and to have confined it by the limitation of words from dangerous wandering to and fro in the mind. The solitude of that Danube camping place, can I ever forget it? The feeling of being utterly alone on an empty planet. My thoughts ran incessantly upon cities and the haunts of men. I would have given my soul, as the saying is, for the feel of those Bavarian villages we had passed through by the score, for the normal human commonplaces, peasants drinking beer, tables beneath the trees, hot sunshine, and a ruined castle on the rocks behind the red-roofed church. Even the tourists would have been welcome. Yet, what I felt of dread was no ordinary ghostly fear. It was infinitely greater, stranger, and seemed to arise from some dim, ancestral sense of terror, more profoundly disturbing than anything I had known or dreamed of. We had strayed, as the Swede put it, into some region or some set of conditions where the risks were great, yet unintelligible to us, where the frontiers of some unknown world lay close about us. It was a spot held by the dwellers in some outer space, a sort of peephole whence they could spy upon the earth, themselves unseen, a point where the veil between had worn a little thin, as the final result of too long a sojourn here. We should be carried over the border and deprived of what we called our lives, yet by mental, not physical, processes in that sense. As he said, we should be the victims of our adventure, a sacrifice. It took us in different fashion, each according to the measure of his sensitiveness and powers of resistance. I translated it vaguely into a personification of the mightily disturbed elements, investing them with the horror of a deliberate and malefic purpose, resentful of our audacious intrusion into their breeding place, whereas my friend threw it into the unoriginal form at first of a trespass on some ancient shrine, some place where the old gods still held sway, where the emotional forces of former worshippers still clung, and the ancestral portion of him yielded to the old pagan spell. At any rate, here was a place unpolluted by men, kept clean by the winds from coarsening human influences, a place where spiritual agencies were within reach and aggressive. Never before or since have I been so attacked by indescribable suggestions of a beyond region, of another scheme of life, another evolution not parallel to the human. And in the end our minds would succumb under the weight of the awful spell, and we should be drawn across the frontier into their world. Small things testified to the amazing influence of the place, and now in the silence round the fire they allowed themselves to be noted by the mind. The very atmosphere had proved itself a magnifying medium to distort every indication. The otter rolling in the current, the hurrying boatman making signs, the shifting willows, one and all had been robbed of its natural character and revealed in something of its other aspect as it existed across the border to the other region. And this changed aspect, I felt, was now not merely to me, but to the race, the whole experience, whose verge we touched was unknown to humanity at all. It was a new order of experience, and in the true sense of the word, unearthly. It's the deliberate, calculating purpose that reduces one's courage to zero, the Swede said suddenly, as if he had been actually following my thoughts. Otherwise, imagination might count for much, but the paddle, the canoe, the lessening food. Haven't I explained all that at once? I interrupted viciously. You have, he answered dryly. You have indeed. He made other remarks too, as usual, about what he called the plain determination to provide a victim. But having now arranged my thoughts better, I recognised that this was simply the cry of his frightened soul against the knowledge that he was being attacked in a vital part, and that he would be somehow taken or destroyed. The situation called for a courage and calmness of reasoning that neither of us could compass. And I have never before been so clearly conscious of two persons in me, the one that explained everything and the other that laughed at such foolish explanations. hands, yet was horribly afraid. Meanwhile, in the pitchy night, the fire died down and the wood pile grew small. Neither of us moved to replenish the stock, and the darkness consequently came up very close to our faces. A few feet beyond the circle of firelight, it was inky black. Occasionally a stray puff of wind set the willows shivering about us, but apart from this, not very welcome sound, a deep and depressing silence reigned, broken only by the gurgling of the river and the humming in the air overhead. We both missed, I think, the shouting company of the winds. At length, at a moment when a stray puff prolonged itself as though the wind were about to rise again, I reached the point for me of saturation, the point where it was absolutely necessary to find relief in plain speech, or else to betray myself by some hysterical extravagance that must have been far worse in its effect upon both of us. I kicked the fire into a blaze and turned to my companion abruptly. He looked up with a start. "I can't disguise it any longer," I said. "I don't like this place, and the darkness, and the noises, and the awful feelings I get. There's something here that beats me utterly. I'm in a blue funk, and that's the plain truth. If the other shore was different, I swear I'd be inclined to swim for it." The Swede's face turned very white beneath the deep tan of sun and wind. He stared straight at me and answered quietly, but his voice betrayed his huge excitement by its unnatural calmness. For the moment, at any rate, he was the strong man of the two. He was more phlegmatic, for one thing. "It's not a physical condition we can escape from by running away," he replied, in the tone of a doctor diagnosing some grave disease. "We must sit tight and wait. There are forces close here that could kill a herd of elephants in a second as easily as you or I could squash a fly. Our only chance is to keep perfectly still. Our insignificance, perhaps, may save us." I put a dozen questions into my expression of face, but found no words. It was precisely like listening to an accurate description of a disease whose symptoms had puzzled me. I mean that so far, although aware of our disturbing presence, they have not found us, not located us, as the Americans say, he went on. "They're plundering about like men hunting for a leak of gas. The paddle and canoe and provisions prove that. I think they feel us, but cannot actually see us. We must keep our minds quiet. It's our minds they feel. We must control our thoughts, or it's all up with us." "Death, you mean?" I stammered, icy with the horror of his suggestion. "Worse, by far," he said. "Death, according to one's belief, means either annihilation or release from the limitations of the senses. But it involves no change of character, You don't suddenly alter just because the body's gone. But this means a radical alteration, a complete change, a horrible loss of oneself by substitution, far worse than death, and not even annihilation. We happen to have camped in a spot where their region touches ours, where the veil between has worn thin. Horrors. He was using my very own phrase, my actual words, so that they are aware of our being in their neighbourhood. But who are aware? I asked. I forgot the shaking of the willows in the windless calm, the humming overhead, everything except that I was waiting for an answer that I dreaded more than I can possibly explain. He lowered his voice at once to reply, leaning forward a little over the fire, an indefinable change in his face that made me avoid his eyes and look down upon the ground. All my life, he said, I have been strangely, vividly conscious of another region, not far removed from our own world in one sense, yet wholly different in kind, where great things go on unceasingly, where immense and terrible personalities hurry by, intent on vast purposes, compared to which earthly affairs, the rise and fall of nations, the destinies of empires, the fate of armies and continents, are all dust in the balance. Vast purposes, I mean, that deal directly with the soul, and not indirectly with mere expressions of the soul. I suggest, just now, I began, seeking to stop him, feeling as though I was face to face with a madman. But he instantly overbore me with his torrent that had to come. You think, he said, it is the spirit of the elements, and I thought perhaps it was the old gods, but I tell you now, it is neither. These would be comprehensible entities, for they have relations with men depending upon them for worship or sacrifice, whereas these beings who are now about us have absolutely nothing to do with mankind, and it is mere chance that their space happens just at this spot to touch our own. The mere conception, which his words somehow made so convincing as I listened to them, there in the dark stillness of that lonely island, set me shaking a little all over. I found it impossible to control my movements. And what do you propose? I began again. A sacrifice, a victim, might save us by distracting them until we could get away, he went on, just as the wolves stop to devour the dogs and give the sleigh another start. But I see no chance of any other victim now. I stared blankly at him. The gleam in his eyes was dreadful. Presently he continued, It's the willows, of course. The willows mask the others, but the others are feeling about for us. If we let our minds betray our fear, we're lost He looked at me with an expression so calm, so determined, so sincere that I no longer had any doubts as to his sanity. He was as sane as any man ever was. If we can hold out through the night, he added, we may get off in the daylight unnoticed, or rather undiscovered. But you really think a sacrifice would? That gong-like humming came down very close over our heads as I spoke, but it was my friend's scared face that really stopped my mouth. Hush, he whispered, holding up his hand. Do not mention them more than you can help. Do not refer to them by name. To name is to reveal. It is the inevitable clue, and our only hope lies in ignoring them in order that they may ignore us. Even in thought. He was extremely agitated, especially in thought. Our thoughts make spirals in their world. We must keep them out of our minds at all costs, if possible. I raked the fire together to prevent the darkness having everything its own way. I never longed for the sun as long as I longed for it then, in the awful blackness of that summer night. Were you awake all night last night? He went on suddenly. I slept badly. A little after dawn, I replied evasively, trying to follow his instructions, which I knew instinctively were true, but the wind, of course. I know, but the wind won't account for all the noises. Then you heard it too. The multiplying countless little footsteps I heard, he said, adding, after a moment's hesitation, and that other sound. You mean above the tent and the pressing down upon us of something tremendous, gigantic? He nodded significantly. It was like the beginning of a sort of inner suffocation, I said. Partly, yes. It seemed to me that the weight of the atmosphere had been altered, had increased enormously so that we should have been crushed. And that, I went on, determined to have it all out, pointing upward where the gong-like note hummed ceaselessly, rising and falling like wind. What do you make of that? It's their sound, he whispered gravely. It's the sound of their world, the humming in their region. The division here is so thin that it leaks through somehow. But if you listen carefully, you'll find it's not above so much as around us. It's in the willows. It's the willows themselves humming, because here the willows have been made symbols of the forces that are against us. I could not follow exactly what he meant by this, yet the thought and idea in my mind were beyond question, the thought and idea in his. I realized what he realized, only with less power of analysis than his. It was on the tip of my tongue to tell him at last about my hallucination of the ascending figures and the moving bushes, when he suddenly thrust his face again close into mine across the firelight and began to speak in a very earnest whisper. He amazed me by his calmness and pluck, his apparent control of the situation. This man I had for years deemed sank his voice again to a whisper before he finished, and I did not press him to explain. There was already just about as much horror in me as I could hold. The conversation came to an end, and we smoked our pipes busily in silence. Then something happened, something unimportant apparently, as the way is when the nerves are in a very great state of tension, and this small thing for a brief space gave me an entirely different point of view. I chanced to look down at my sand shoe, the sort we used for the canoe, and something to do with the hole at the toe suddenly recalled me to the London shop where I had bought them. The difficulty the man had in fitting me, and other details of the uninteresting but practical operation. At once in its train followed a wholesome view of the modern, sceptical world I was accustomed to move in at home. I thought of roast beef and ale, motor cars, policemen, brass bands, and a dozen other things that proclaimed the soul of ordinariness or utility. The effect was immediate and astonishing even to myself. Psychologically, I suppose it was simply a sudden violent reaction after the strain of living in an atmosphere of things that to the normal consciousness must seem impossible and incredible. But whatever the cause, it momentarily lifted the spell from my heart and left me for the short space of a minute feeling free and utterly unafraid. I looked up at my friend opposite. "You damned old pagan," I cried, laughing aloud in his face. "You imaginative idiot. You superstitious idolater, you." I stopped in the middle, seized anew by mild horror. I tried to smother the sound of my voice as something sacrilegious. The Swede, of course, heard it too. The strange cry overhead in the darkness, and that sudden drop in the air as though something had come nearer. Okay, I'm going to stop there for tonight. Sorry to leave you on a cliffhanger. I'll do the remaining part of chapter 4 next Sunday, along with chapter 5, as chapter 5 is very short. So until